All right, let's stir up some controversy. Yesterday, these two white men met in the White House in a room filled with their all white cabinet ministers. Very much a white press corps, but that's a different story. But here is what was actually said in this
You
meeting.
know, as a real estate developer, I'm a real estate developer at heart. When you get rid of that artificially drawn line, somebody drew that line many years ago with like a ruler, just a straight line right across the top of the country. When you look at that beautiful formation when it's together, I'm a very artistic person, but when I looked at that beauty, I said that's the way it was meant to be.
From real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
That's true.
We're sitting in one right now, Buckingham Palace that you visited as well.
That's true.
And having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign last several months, it's not for sale, won't be for sale.
Now, first of all, that's not what we said. We as Canadians, we said we don't want to. We didn't say it's not going to happen. And I'm actually quite surprised that Carney didn't get Zelensky in this meeting here, because Canada's just not in a position to fight the U.S. Let's be honest, we just cannot defeat them militarily, economically, or politically. We cannot. And we kind of have been acting like the 51st state for a while now. I mean, Canada just agreed to deploy $1.3 billion spending plan and nearly 10,000 frontline personnel to the border to fix a problem that doesn't exist and just to appease Donald Trump. There is no border problem. We just decided to spend that money just to make him happy. But I want you to remember that we're still waiting for clean water to reach the indigenous communities in this country. We've been waiting on this for a long, long time. And we haven't been independent of the United States. We haven't been independent of their foreign policies for a long time, which is literally what the federal government takes care of anyways, right? I mean, let's look at Afghanistan war. So 2001, 2014, Canada committed troops, especially to a very deadly area, the Kandahar combat zone, largely to prove loyalty to the US and NATO after refusing to join Iraq. I mean, that was the last time Canada said no to the US anyways. Remember the times of John Chrétien when he said, we're just not going to do it? But I want to quote something here. This is Eugene Lang. He says, our participation in Kandahar was a political decision to maintain credibility with our allies, particularly in the US. He was a former chief of staff to Canada's defense minister. Again, let's talk about the Anti-Terrorism Act and border security. Canada passed sweeping anti-terrorism laws and adopted U.S. Style border security to reassure the U.S. and keep the borders open for trade. Again, John Manley, we had to adopt measures the U.S. trusted or risked having our border thickened and our economy harmed. This is a real thing, okay? In 2012, Canada decided to cut ties with Iran. It closed its Tehran embassy and expelled Iranian diplomats, going further than most, honestly, allies, in lockstep with the U.S. Towards Iran, right? Paul Heinbecker said this is a dramatic overreach intended to align Canada with the U.S. Policy. So it wasn't in our interest. We just did it because the U.S. wanted us to. And then ever since 2006, right, Canada has consistently voted with the U.S. and Israel against U.S. resolutions critical of Israeli settlements, isolating itself really in a sense and internationally just to match the U.S. policy. Let's look at what Michael Bell said. He was a former Canadian ambassador to Israel. He said Canada has adopted a voting pattern identical to the U.S., sacrificing diplomatic independence for political alignment. These are a real thing. And then let's look at Magnitsky sanction laws. These are happened in 2017. Canada adopted a U.S.-style sanctions against human rights abusers shortly after the U.S. legislation, partly to avoid appearing soft or lagging behind the U.S. leadership. So let's look at this here. Canada's Magnitsky Act mirrored U.S. priorities rather than creating an independent sanctions. This was written in the Carleton University Policy Options. But let's look at other things. Like, let's look at the economic, trade, and policies, right? So just recently, in 2018, Canada gave the U.S. Dairy producers market access to a very important part of the USMCA negotiations, primarily just to secure a broader trade deal under the U.S. pressures. And I'm going to quote the person whom Donald Trump hates the most here at everybody else. Chrystia Freeland, she said, "We didn't want to give it up, but the Americans insisted. It was a price to pay to keep the NAFTA alive." Okay, let's keep going. In 2018, Canada arrested Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou on a U.S. extradition request enforcing U.S. sanctions despite Canadian reluctance and no independent security case. Again, Justin Trudeau said, "We are fulfilling our legal obligations under the treaty with the U.S." And let's be honest, Canada cannot prevent this if the U.S. pursues it. Canada will not. Canadians will not be so patriotic when unemployment lines surge, when prices increase, when homelessness becomes a real thing. No one is going to fight. Alberta is going to be the first to break off and join the U.S., Saskatchewan, and the rest of the country will follow. This is real talk.